Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this conference today. I'm Professor Jonathan Glassard, and I work at Leeds Beckett University. I'm Professor of Inclusive Education, and we wanted to run this conference today to focus on the impact of COVID-19 on the well-being of children and young people and also education professionals. We know that obviously children and young people and teachers have experienced multiple transitions over the last few months. So we know that children have experienced new ways of learning. They've had to move from being educated in schools and colleges to being educated online. They've had social transitions, so we know that obviously their access to friendships and networks and clubs and societies has been restricted. And we know that some of these transitions have resulted in negative psychological transitions, but also for some young people, it's resulted in positive psychological transitions. So for some young people, they will have had positive experiences during COVID, and for others, they will have had negative experiences. And we're interested in the impact that this has had on children's mental health and the mental health of teachers, but also what the long-term impact of COVID will be on the mental health and well-being of children and young people and teachers and other education professionals. So we've got a rich range of presentations today. I'm going to be co-chairing the conference with my colleague, Dr. Suzanne Culshaw, and we will actually receive your questions and we'll try and respond to them as we go along. So I hope you have a really, really lovely morning, and please feel free to participate in the conference. So I'd like to hand over now to my colleague, Suzanne. Hi, Suzanne.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone. I'm Suzanne Culshaw, Dr. Suzanne Culshaw from the University of Hertfordshire, where I'm a research fellow, but where I also was very lucky to receive a scholarship to do my PhD. Just to give you a little bit about why I'm particularly interested in the topic of today's conference is I explored what it means to be struggling as a teacher, and I took the word struggling and I have repositioned it out of the performativity arena, out of the capability arena, and I've put it where it belongs, in the well-being arena. And I argue that struggling is a temporary fractured state, and if you like, it's a bit like a transitional state. It's a bit of a liminal space. So really looking forward to hearing the presentations today and to engaging with your questions that you're posing to the presenters. So back to you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Okay, so we're going to now go into our first presentation. So our first presentation is from Dr. Josie Maitland. So Josie has been a teacher and is now a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Brighton. And Josie's research focuses on student and staff resilience. And Josie has been conducting research with education professionals and has done quite a lot of data collection over the last few weeks, and is going to present some of her emerging findings. Thank you, Josie.
Hi, everyone. So, yeah, as Jonathan said, during this time that there's been a great deal of uncertainty for everybody, but also for school staff, change and additional demands, which have brought their own stresses. I've been doing some research to look at how school staff have experienced COVID-19, and I'm going to share some very early reflections on that research. It's still ongoing research. The data analysis is still in process, but there are some things that might be useful to start thinking about and might be interesting for you to hear about that I'm going to share with you. So you might notice I've started this slide with prioritising staff wellbeing as opposed to teacher wellbeing. First important thing I wanted to say was that we often research in wellbeing in schools around staff tends to be quite teacher centric, and the problem with that is that we exclude role types within the school community that have value in their own wellbeing, of course, but also are fundamental to supporting pupil wellbeing. So we're thinking about teaching assistants and those that work in canteens or playgrounds and leaders. And so I've referred throughout to staff wellbeing because I want to think about staff as a whole group of people in the school community and how this time has impacted them. So it's important to say that pre-COVID, there were already concerns around staff wellbeing. Staff were reporting high workplace stress, high workload, and we've had falling retention since 2008. So staff wellbeing is a really important focus and was an important focus before COVID. But obviously during COVID-19, school staff have had the additional task of adapting curriculum to be delivered online, learning all the new software that needed to be adapted to be able to do that, implementing policy that was changing, and finding ways to support not only their own well-being, but their colleagues, their families, the pupils that they support, and so on. So the pandemic really has had a profound impact on mental health and well-being across the population, and that's been an ongoing conversation in the media and online about what we are starting to understand about the magnitude of what people have been through during this time. And so the research that I'm going to share with you today is has that behind it, that desire to find out what the impact has been for this particular group of people, school staff. So in existing literature, without going sort of too deep into this, as I said, it does tend to be quite teacher-centric, and could possibly be seen as grouped into kind of two areas. So we know a lot about risk factors that we think are behind stress and burnout for school staff, and we know lots about what supports staff wellbeing. And this is not an exhaustive list, this protective and risk factor box that I've put at the bottom, but just were things that I was starting to think about, that I was curious to think about how this might have changed during COVID-19, or how this might have been impacted during COVID-19. So we know that a sense of professional purpose, or vocational drive, and the positive relationships between staff and their pupils, and staff and one another, staff and their colleagues, are really important to be able to sustain staff wellbeing. And so during this time of COVID, how has that been sustained? To what extent has that been possible? And in terms of risk factors, school systems are perpetually changing. They are in almost a constant state of flux and change. And sometimes that's excessive. And during this particular time, there's a whole load of additional adversity that staff are dealing with. So I was interested in how that additional change was impacting staff. Arguably, there's been a reduction in some of the external accountability measures, which are sometimes related to risk factors for staff wellbeing. But then on the other hand, there's been an increased scrutiny of how schools have adapted and have implemented policy and what they've been doing during this time. And we've seen that in media headlines about teachers and other school staff. So these are the questions that were in my head kind of approaching the research and why it was important to do it. The aim of the research then was to explore school staff experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic, including to identify the impact on staff mental health and well-being. And I had a specific focus on things that staff felt had sustained or improved their well-being during this time. So what has helped? And that's because I was interested in the concept of resilience, not in terms of grit or individual capacity to cope alone as an isolated facet that people have or don't have, but in terms of the individual and then school level and then policy level factors that all interact in a kind of dynamic flow that results in resilience. So the extent to which staff have been able to adapt during this time of additional adversity and sustain their well-being. And so I won't read the research questions out, but you can see that there were three main research questions around what has changed, what has the impact been of that change, and what factors have been related to well-being during this time. So as I said, this is an ongoing research process. So I recruited online via Twitter. There was an immediate, very, very positive response. I think that speaks volumes in terms of how important this issue was to school staff. and an acknowledgement of the opportunity to be able to share some of their experiences. There was a really diverse range of people who responded, which was great in terms of the sample. So leaders and middle leaders and teachers and non-teachers from a whole range of different settings. I think on the next slide there's a list of settings, but everything from early years to FE and alternative provision and special needs sector. So a really broad range of staff from different backgrounds. And I conducted 20 interviews online over Skype of around an hour. And I invited the participants to bring an image or an object or a word to those conversations, just as a starting point, because we were reflecting on a time which has been so tumultuous and continually changing day to day, that I wanted an anchor point for that discussion where people had had an opportunity to reflect on their experiences before our conversation and just open up the richness of the conversation from the object. And right now the interviews have been transcribed, so we're just going into the process of thematic analysis on the data. So what I'm going to share today is actually still being analysed, and so are just my initial observations and thoughts from the conversations that I've had, rather than findings. But context is key, really. Every experience that I spoke to people was very unique and was in their own personal context, and is also a changing story. It was really clear that even though all of the interviews happened in the month of June, the beginning of June, where people were still adapting to working from home in many cases and dealing with putting lessons online, in the middle of June, when people were going back into school in various different roles and teaching their bubbles, to the end of June, when people were looking ahead to September, there was already shifting phases that people were going through. So the interview was really a snapshot, a moment in time of how people were experiencing COVID. I spoke to 7 members of senior leadership, including 3 heads, 9 teachers, 3 pastoral and support staff. And you'll notice, if you're better at maths than me, that adds up to 19, because I've got 1 interview scheduled that I haven't done yet, so there'll be 1 more. Settings include early years, primary, junior, secondary, FE, and right across the UK, a really big spread of locations. So I'm sure we all feel this to some extent, that this time's been a roller coaster of emotions and of experiences. And lots of people that I spoke to used that analogy, so I wanted to bring that image to this slide. I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of these headings, but behind these headings clearly are very rich and detailed personal stories. And I think it would be impossible to convey the depth of some of the things that I was told during this presentation, both in terms of time and also because we haven't finished the analysis. But I am going to just talk about a couple of these headings. Participants, they talked about a sense of loss. So the school staff that I spoke to, they meant different things by the sense of loss, and in the most literal sense, school communities have experienced bereavement, and so staff have been supporting members of their community, staff or pupils and their families, with a grieving process, and may also have experienced their own loss during this time. And that's been made more difficult by the limited social interaction. So the ways that we might normally support people going through these times has been restricted by our limited social interaction. Additionally to that, there's been a loss of milestones, of endings and transitions. So staff talked about not having sports day, not having end of term parties, not having end of year assemblies, not just having those conversations on the last day of school where you might be signing someone's shirt or talking about where they're going next. And that abrupt ending for lots of staff of the last day in school, being when the school's closed for most pupils, felt for a lot of staff very flat and very empty and almost quite eerie as schools cleared out very rapidly. And those meaningful relationships tended to and fostered over, in some cases, a number of years, both with colleagues and with pupils, were sort of left hanging, and quite difficult for staff to manage that sort of just silence, and a reflection about those transitions that we put in place for pupils are really important for pupils, but they are also very important for staff as a way of being able to end the school year and have some closure on time spent with pupils and staff. There's also a sense of a loss of external validation. So staff are working really, really hard towards an anticipated inspection or exams, where they get a reflection of what they may have put in terms of work and preparation, and as a staff team collectively building towards this external validation point, and then not having those inspections or exams. Although, as I said earlier, those accountability measures can be related to stress for staff. Actually, staff were talking about, well, it feels like a lot of work's being put in, but nothing's going to come of it. And by the time we are then assessed or inspected, it's a very, very different world we're going back into, and all those things we had put in place are going to need to be picked up again in a very different way. And finally, the loss of social interaction. So obviously schools are places of social interaction and of community, and staff have been talking about missing face-to-face interaction with colleagues in the staff room, missing those one-to-one interactions in learning with pupils, and being able to feel the difference that you are making to a pupil, which isn't the same as teaching online or responding to an email. I'm not going to go through them all one by one, but if I can combine the preparing for the unknown under pressure and the constant change. Obviously, with the policy guidance being released at the same time to staff as families and the general public and the media, there was very limited time to prepare and plan. And staff reflected on, that I spoke to in my conversations, they reflected on, we like to feel in control and we like to be able to plan and preempt. That's our job. And during this time, there was a sense of feeling out of control and out of our comfort zones. Obviously, nobody had trained for this situation. There was a lot to learn very, very quickly, and a lot of responsibility in decision making, with often conflicting information or not enough information to make a decision. So that was quite anxiety provoking for staff, and particularly I think for leaders who were making decisions and then communicating that to staff. And the leaders that I spoke to talked about buffering the stress for their staff as much as they possibly could. And because the guidance was coming out in the way that it did, schools planned and prepared relentlessly for multiple situations that not always came to fruition or then needed to change again. So that there was an element of increased workload around that as well. And this sort of, I think there was a lot of talk about whack-a-mole. So one problem emerged, it was dealt with, and another problem emerged. And that phrase was kind of picked up quite a lot during this time of COVID-19. But the way that staff were describing the situation to me was a little bit more like a snow globe, where the dust sort of just settled, the snow just settled, and people just felt, oh, I've got the hang of this now, I'm just about okay with this, and then it was shaken up again with the next piece of information or change that was happening. And all of that resulted in this kind of sense of a different kind of busy. So staff talked about, we're busier than we ever have been in a sense, but it's not the busyness we're used to. It's not the being active in the school environment, popping into a colleague's classroom for a quick chat between lessons, or going from one year group to another. It's this sitting at a desk, having to set work online and absorb and process information. So our minds were very busy, but we weren't active in the same way. And obviously people were also juggling. So those with families at home were having to juggle their own family commitments and work. Work had been brought into the home. Even if people didn't have families at home, that's difficult. Staff talked about, you know, I either escape from work at home or I escape into my work, and neither of those were possible during this time. And people also talked about the sacrifices that they'd made in terms of their personal lives. So they talked about not seeing elderly relatives during this time because they were working and they didn't want to pass things on to their relatives, or feeling guilty that they were neither good enough from their perception in their parent role or good enough in their teaching role, or doing enough to help if they had to be at home. And so there was an importance on values, and people often talked about a sense of duty or purpose, driving what they were doing and sustaining them and justifying the very difficult decisions that they had to make. So obviously there's a lot in that, and there's a lot more for me to still unpick. I think with this sense of importance of values, staff that I spoke to also reflected on their own values during this time in relation to their job. What are my values, what's important and what matters to me? And it's brought into sharp focus either a real love for their job that they're not able to do as fully as they would like to right now, or for some people it's brought into question, why do we do things in the way that we do things? Is that compatible with the values that I'm bringing to the role? So I just want to, this is a word cloud activity, and I know that there's going to be a short delay till you can see. I'm just waiting for confirmation that you can see what I can see. But what I would like is if you could enter in what has sustained your own well-being during the pandemic, because that's what I'm going to move to now. I'm going to think about what participants told me about what had sustained their own well-being. And I'm sure that there are going to be some crossovers here. So we can already see CPD, family, reading and dogs. Oh, lots more coming through now. I can see nature, the outdoors. That's interesting, somebody's put stress. So I wonder if it's a case of kind of running on adrenaline, that sense. That definitely came through in some of the conversations that I had. So I'll just give that a moment for a few more to pop up. Again, we see a focus on core values. Some saying it hasn't been sustained, and that's a really good point, because for some people, there was that sense of, well, I haven't had anything that sustained my well-being. Actually, I did want to say that particularly for senior leaders, there did seem to be this sense that there was such a focus on looking after others' well-being that some people felt as though they were falling through the gaps, felt as though I'm so worried about looking after parents and pupils and my colleagues, and who's looking after me. Wow, what a fantastic range of things. I think there's so much in there that I'm just going to reiterate now in terms of participants. I think that stays running so that we can come back to it later. And I'd love to have a closer look at that in more detail. But there's such a range of things there. And you can see that, as I was saying, in terms of the research, you've got individual factors, the things that you are in control of that you can do as kind of self-help. And then you've got social, kind of within your immediate social system, factors as well that require support from other people in order to feed your own well-being. Really interesting themes: trust, faith, and the use of technology, which, you know, we have a relationship with technology where it can be both good and bad, but this really resonates with what participants said about technology being a useful way to sustain connection. I'm going to move on from that, but I could say more about this in the context of the participants. So for many people, this was a sense of, look, this is going to be a very choppy time. We're going through a storm and we need to try to stay afloat. And so as with the word cloud that we just saw, lots of these are similar to what you've just been putting in the word cloud there. So the support of colleagues and family and friends, feedback from pupils and parents, the sense of feeling useful and keeping busy in order to replace that immediate kind of sense of job satisfaction that might have happened in the workplace. As I was saying, some people, senior leaders, did feel as though they were falling through the gaps in terms of being able to reach out to people. So people's networks were expanding. People talked to me about going online for the first time and going onto Twitter, or finding a community of people in a similar role to them, in both locally and nationally and internationally, that they could have conversation with and check out what their plans were in terms of reassurance, and just venting in some cases. WhatsApp groups were set up. Some people decided to access supervision, so kind of non-judgmental opportunity to talk about their experiences in their role. and some people had that provided by their school, and some people were actually buying in that service, acknowledging that it was useful to them. A whole range of different things that were informing people's well-being during this time. And something really important I wanted to bring out was there's been a good deal of focus on what pupils have been learning at home during this time, but actually staff have been learning a great deal too. So staff have been doing an increased amount of CPD, they've been networking, they've been learning, they've been reflecting critically on their practice, and it's been an opportunity for reflecting on things like the importance of relationships, the importance of staff and pupil wellbeing as the absolute foundation for everything else that follows. And the potential seemed to be emerging in the conversations I was having for challenging the stigma of having to mask your emotions, and understanding the problems that brings if they're not, if our emotions aren't given a place in our conversations with colleagues, and in terms of what we do in school policy, and our well-being is not a fundamental focus. So what's important here is we had a situation that was arguably unsustainable in relation to staff wellbeing before COVID, and this opportunity of learning is important in order to bring about positive change. And it's not to underestimate the magnitude of what staff have been through during this time. It's actually to say, well, there's an opportunity here for learning and for prioritising staff wellbeing, but also thinking about our collective values, that sense of belonging and community that staff have been missing during this time, and how we prioritise that. So staff have been talking about some online tools being really useful, and increased communication with parents during this time being really useful. Small groups with pupils being very useful. More time spent outside, both in learning environments at school and for staff in their own life, being something that we want to sustain. And things like being able to praise pupils, those quieter pupils who may not want to put their hand up in class, in a different format. So very kind of, there's a lot of detail in there of things that have worked well that we can sustain. These expanded networks and so on. There's this feeling that there's a lot of value in this time away from the frenetic pace of school life to reflect. Now, clearly, there's a risk of burnout with just the amount that staff have been through during this time. Staff can't begin to support pupils, and pupils are going to need support in September. But staff can't do that fully without staff wellbeing being a priority as well. Some staff are absolutely on their knees and have been running mostly on the fuel of what matters to them in terms of their professional role and the values that they bring to their job. And they've been doing that in spite of continual change, in spite of, in some sense, being frustrated at perhaps public perception of their profession, and in spite of the tensions and difficulties of managing their personal situation alongside their professional situation. So we mustn't underestimate that. But I think out of this time, if we accept that September is a starting point and not the finish line, and that things cannot return to a new normal, it's like the plays being completely rewritten and we can't go up on stage and read the same lines again. We need to adapt. And for staff to be able to adapt, wellbeing needs to be a focus for a conversation where staff are listened to about what they need and what matters to them, both in terms of their wellbeing, but also in terms of how we teach and how we educate, and why we teach and why we educate. And just going back to the title of my presentation to sort of finish off, through the fog, this time has been incredibly foggy. We haven't known what's coming next. We've had to think on our feet and adapt. It's been difficult for us all. And the fog sort of feels like it's starting to clear a little bit, but we're not out of the fog yet. Weather conditions can change at any moment, and I'm sure there'll be other difficult storms that we have to weather. And the temptation is that as that fog starts to clear, we see this very familiar landscape on the horizon, and there's a temptation just to start slogging up to the summit again in the same way, without checking, well, what do we need to get there and where are we going? And they're the questions that I think will be really, really important as we go back to the term after a very well deserved rest, which I hope people do get to have. So I'm just going to leave this slide up whilst I think we're going to have a short opportunity for questions, but there's my contact information. I'll be really keen, as I say, this is a dip your toe in the water, whistle stop tour of what I've been listening to from staff. And as that analysis process comes to a close, I'd be really excited to share the more detailed findings from that. So please do get in touch if you're interested to know more.
Thank you, Josie. That was an excellent presentation. Really, really enjoyed that. We're just going to do 2 questions and then we'll return to the others, hopefully at the end of the presentations. Okay, so Becky has asked, did you find that the technology also had a negative impact on staff? Such as, using WhatsApp or using, online teaching?
Yeah, I think what came through quite strongly was both sides of the coin. So we had the positive impact of networking on platforms like Twitter and WhatsApp to connect with staff. People seem to be using WhatsApp as a much more informal social interaction, and then email related to work issues. So people were finding ways to create these boundaries, and I think that's what was key. Technology can be useful if we have some control over how it's being used and the impact we allow it to have. So some people had, for example, a work phone and a home phone so that they could turn the work phone off, or they had muted particular words on Twitter if they felt particularly riled up by an issue and they were noticing that it was detrimental to them. I think one of the participants used a phrase like, I started to feel wound up like a watch spring, and there was an atmosphere of blame. And I think when that starts happening, being able to draw a line and say, that's not useful for me. So people were quite reflective and quite consciously aware of what was helpful and not helpful, but definitely both sides.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Josie. Lots of positive comments here about your presentation. Very interesting, and lots of thanks. A question here from Catherine, which has been liked by lots of people. So I'm going for the popular question. She was wondering if you're starting to find, it might be a bit too soon to say this, but I'm going to ask anyway, if you're starting to find any differences in the way that different generations or ages or experience levels of teachers have approached or responded to COVID.
Yeah, I think it is too early really to have the definitive answer to that. There's definitely a distinction between different responsibilities and responses to COVID. I'm not saying role types, because actually during this time that's been in flux. So you've got people who this wasn't necessarily their job, but they've been carrying out this role, and depending on what their role has been during this time, there has been increased anxiety or increased pressure. I think in terms of years of experience, I did collect that information, and sometimes that correlated with role, though not always. I don't think so necessarily in terms of age. That didn't strike me from the conversations. In terms of years of experience and then that being closely related to role, I think possibly this is a tentative guess, that those with more experience of teaching had more resources to draw on, had experienced difficult and changing circumstances in the past in school, and had that to draw on. But even those staff were saying, this is unlike anything I've ever experienced, and it's just hands down the most challenging time I've experienced in my career. So I don't think, certainly wasn't a magic bullet for people having more experience, but certainly more to compare it to at least.
Okay, thank you.
And just one more, Josie. So Peter's asked, what do you mean by altruistic motivation for staff who are not teachers?
So I guess what I would be looking at there is people talked about the satisfaction that they get from being able to make a difference to a child that they're working with. So for example, I spoke to teaching assistants who were working directly with certain pupils, And actually what was very difficult for them during this time was they had formed a very close bond with, it may even be just 1 or 2 young people that they were attached to on a daily basis, that they weren't actually having any contact with face-to-face during this time. They may have sent an email, but because it was a teaching responsibility to initiate contact with home, and even those teachers might not see that person face-to-face, there's just an immediate and abrupt end to that ability to actually form a relationship with that person and make a difference to them. And that motivation and desire to go above and beyond what is actually your role in your job description or what you're being paid for, because it matters to you and because you have a satisfaction in being able to do that for that young person.
Okay, thank you. That was a really, really interesting presentation, and we'll be really interested to see the findings when it's been published.
Great, thank you.
So we're going to, thank you, Josie. We're going to move on to the next presentation, which is going to be a video presentation, because so this is Professor Divya Jindal-Snape. So Divya is Professor of Education, Inclusion and Life Transitions at the University of Dundee. She's not able to be here because she's not well at the moment, but she's very kindly recorded the presentation. She is the developer of multiple and multidimensional transitions theory. So this is the idea that people experience multiple transitions all at the same time, rather than seeing transitions as being linear and sequential. So we'll listen to Divya.
I'm Divya Jindal-Snape from the University of Dundee, and today I would like to talk with you about COVID-19 and its impact on well-being within the context of multiple and multidimensional transitions. When doing so, I would refer to 3 pieces. One is Pandemic Tales, which is an anthology of comics, transitions blogs that we've been writing, as well as some of our primary secondary transitions research for illustration purposes. So before we start, can I ask you to reflect on what transitions mean to you, as well as what transitions do you think children and young people have experienced so far and are likely to experience in light of COVID-19? Please tweet as you go along. So let's start off with a conceptualization of primary secondary school transitions in the research literature. We undertook a systematic literature review over 10 years, and we found that in most of the studies, the conceptualization wasn't explicit, and we had to infer it on the basis of theory and methodology. We had reviewed 96 papers. Of those, 86 included some insight into researchers' conceptualization, but like I said, we had to infer that. And so what we found was that the conceptualizations could be categorized as transition being change, a normative life transition, normative period in school career, multiple transitions, and discontinuity, both curricular and relationships, and rite of passage. If I can then also bring in my definition of transitions, for me, transition is an ongoing process of psychological, social, and educational adaptation. Happens over time due to changes in context, interpersonal relationships, and identity. So the focus here being transition is not change. Transition is a process of adaptation that happens due to that change. And that adaptation process is psychological, social, educational. And transitions are both exciting and worrying, and they can be that for the same child at the same time. And because they're ongoing, they require ongoing support. We also looked at authors' discourse about primary secondary transitions. Now, the reason for looking at that is that conceptualization and discourse can actually give us a pretty good idea of what transition planning and support is going to be put in place. So in terms of discourse, we found that out of 96 papers, only 2 papers had a positive discourse, i.e. they started with an open mind and they were looking for what was coming through, and they kept a balanced positive discourse about that. Then we had some papers which were very clearly had a negative as well as a positive discourse, but out of those 25, 15 highlighted more negatives than positives. And then we had neutral discourse from 9 papers, and in that, they weren't at all talking about the impact of transitions. Transition was a period they had looked at. And finally, and overwhelmingly, 60 papers had the negative discourse. And the study started with the premise and argument that was based on previous literature and the findings that were negative. And then their research also found transition to be negative, i.e., it was about disruption and challenge. It was about decline in achievement in particular subjects, high dropout rates, stress and anxiety, and being challenging for children with additional support needs. And this discourse is quite interesting because in our study, we undertook data collection over 4 stages in the final year of primary school up to the end of second year of secondary school. And as you can see, we asked them a question about what are you looking forward to in P7 and what has been good in S1 and S2. And the findings are here in percentage. And you can see that when children were in P7, they were looking forward to different subjects, making new friends, more independence, more choice and opportunities, bigger school, a range of things that they were looking forward to. And actually, some of them they found to be even better after they arrived in secondary school and over time. And we also asked them what they were worried about in P7 and what was still worrying them. And again, you can see that there were several things they were worried about, such as losing old friends, bullying, more homework, finding their way around school, moving away from some classmates and things like that. And as you can see, the dark blue is before they started secondary school. And after they moved to secondary school, a lot of those anxieties went down really low. So if we start looking at primary, secondary transition or any transition, and if we keep an open, positive mind, then we might be finding different things. However, this discourse is not surprising because the discourse we find in children and young people's natural environment is quite negative. And what we found was that in one of our studies, a child talked about primary school's preparation hadn't helped because all that had happened was the teacher just became strict and they said the teachers at secondary school are very strict. And when they moved to secondary school, they didn't find that to be the case. In another child's case, their cousin told them about lunches and they said they got really confused, was really scared. She showed me her maths daughter and looked really hard. But when it was actually me, that was a secondary school, it's not really that hard. You do get a little bit frightened. So before they're coming, they're getting all these negative messages from family members and teachers, and then they might be spending some time being anxious about those transitions. But in reality, when they come to secondary school, they're finding that they didn't need to be anxious. But we also find similar narratives in children's storybooks and movies. So for Harry Potter, for example, you know that he's going to start secondary school. He's excited about moving away from not so pleasant kinship parents for him. But even before he arrives at the school, he experiences lots of different experiences, some of which were actually quite scary. Similarly, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, where the elder brother comes and tells his younger brother, Mom has asked me to come and speak with you. My advice will be don't look at anybody, don't do this, don't do this, don't do that. And then he finishes off, whom am I fooling? By the end of the year, you're either going to be dead or homeschooled anyway. Now, it is meant to be, it's said in jest, it's funny, but probably not so for a child who's just about to start middle school. And in Harry Potter, of course, the takeaway message is also that friendships are important and they get through this. You will feel supported despite bullying from peers and also some of the teachers. However, if you're a child who's just read volume 1, that might not be at the top of your mind. And if we start looking at the discourse in media about COVID-19, there is a lot of statistics and discourse that, to be honest, can be quite scary for a child. And things like about empty shelves, number of deaths, and then the school's closure. But more recently, for example, the Scottish First Minister in our case said those peoples most likely to return will be who are vulnerable, making transition from primary to secondary school, etc. Now, it implies that it's only children who are moving from one school to the other are making a transition. Just the physical move is not transition. As I said earlier, transition is psychological, social, educational. There are several aspects to it. So this focus doesn't help and could be problematic for some children. And if you look at, for example, a child who's in the last year of secondary school, and they find out that the school's going to close, and all of a sudden they've been told, okay, this Friday is going to be the last day at school. So they are actually rushing, realizing that all the plans they had for the last year are not going to happen, and the schools will be closed. They're not going to meet their friends again. And then they find that exams have been cancelled, and all the anticipation they had about sitting the exam, maybe being worried about exams, but now finding that they won't have any exams, they might not feel the same sense of achievement than they would have felt if they had sat it. Also, certain expected normative transitions, for example, having the leavers ball or having the end of year book, all of those things might be disrupted for them. And therefore, there are lots of transitions all children are experiencing, not just primary, secondary ones. And there are other transitions because of lockdown, children not being able to go outside. So imagine somebody living in multi-story building with no garden, what sort of transition they are having because of the lockdown. And then the children who will be either relying on free school meals or children who are for whom homes are not safe spaces, what is happening for them on all the different transitions they will be experiencing. So, of course, there are all these different transitions happening, and literature does talk about the impact of transitions on well-being. But as you're probably very well aware, well-being is the least well-defined term. And it can include emotional and psychological well-being, spiritual well-being, physical well-being, and social well-being. And so when we were reviewing the literature, we focused on studies that had any of those aspects included. So, for example, they might have emotional well-being was their focus. And we found only 20 studies that focus on at least one aspect of these, of well-being. Out of those 20 studies, 4 studies actually reported that transition had a positive impact on people's well-being outcomes. And one study said it had led to improvement in quality of life. But one study was actually considering no dip in self-esteem to be a positive. And out of those 20 studies, 16 studies reported negative impacts on people's well-beings, which then manifested in increase in school misbehavior, decline in feelings of school belongingness and connectedness, poorer social and emotional health, and higher levels of depression and anxiety. And we know that the increase in people's anxiety during transitions are associated with lack of positive relationships, decreased connectedness, as well as decline in perceived school belongingness. But we also are aware that if unresolved, these experiences can lead to long-term mental health issues and also lower educational outcomes, including psychiatric difficulties throughout the lifespan in some cases. And so what literature then says is that what helps with well-being in transitions is positive relationships with peers, with teachers, with family members, ongoing, honest, clear communication between different parties, and children and young people having a voice and agency, some control. They are crucial for successful transitions. And we can also see this from our 4-stage longitudinal design study, where we asked them about their support systems. And as you can see, the top support networks were parents, grandparents, brothers, sister, cousin, classmates, and friends. And this more or less didn't shift from P7 to S2. These stayed constant. And it is probably because family is one of the few constant support systems they have through any and every transition they will experience. So in some ways, it is actually quite reassuring to know that the people they consider to be their closest support network are actually the ones they are at home with. Unfortunately, the teachers and guidance teacher come quite lower down on that. But don't be disheartened. It might be because of the time they spend with families. When we talk about successful transition, but what does that look like? And some researchers talk about school adjustment and good attainment and attendance, and others talk about social and emotional adjustment, where they like school, they don't feel lonely, they have a sense of belonging and well-being, and they have respectful, reciprocal relationships with peers and teachers. And I agree with the latter school of thought, because successful transitions should be about flourishing socially and psychologically, and of course educationally too, but not at the cost of well-being. And when we're talking about children's transitions and well-being, we also have to remember that COVID-19 meant that teachers had to, within a short period of time, think about how they can support children with their home learning, with their psychological social transitions. And all this planning is happening, and they were running around with very short time periods. So there were lots of changes happening for them in very short time. And this had left them worried about how they could support the children as well as their families. But as the head teacher on the right hand says, it is a transition for all of us. You need to consider your well-being too, and you can't support them or their parents if you are stressed. And the head teacher says, how can I support you? So it's important to recognize that teachers are going through transitions as well. And teachers are going through transitions along with their children, but also what is happening is that these transitions are not just professional, they're also personal. And these professional transitions are again about how can I support my students, how do I do home working, but also personal one when somebody's partner is worried about their job or their company, when the children need their attention because the children are homeschooling. So all these transitions are happening. And so not only are these transitions happening, multiple transitions happening, these are happening in different domains which have come together. And we know from research that people do adapt over time, and they do it relatively quickly. But there is also research to suggest that there can be a differential impact on those with additional support needs. And in fact, transitions can trigger additional support needs for others. And if you think about what has been happening in the recent research from Barnardo's, young people have reported that because there's been lack of clear communication about COVID-19 from the government, it has actually been really detrimental to their mental health. So we need to think about all that, and this is happening during our multiple transitions, both personal, professional, and all sorts of different positive, negative transitions we might be experiencing. But that's not the only thing that's happening. We are experiencing them, but our transitions are interacting with the transitions of other people. So if we think of, see a Rubik's Cube and think about one side of Rubik's Cube being a child and their ecosystem. So yellow is child one, their parents, their teachers, their friends, and green might be another set of another child's ecosystem, blue might be another child's ecosystem. Any change in one person's ecosystem is going to lead to change in another person's ecosystem. And this is the multidimensional aspect. So not only are children having multiple transitions themselves, their transitions, for example, we saw in the case of homeschooling, trigger a transition for the parent who needs to be able to support their home learning. However, the parents are experiencing their own transition, for example, in terms of working from home. and their transition of working from home is then triggering transitions for their children and how they can support their children. So transitions that we experience are multiple as well as multidimensional. And finally, what I would like you to do is go back to thinking of your COVID-19 and transitions. Has your conceptualization changed? If it has, what has, and how will you work differently as a professional? And if not, why might that be? So please tweet, and thank you.
I like the fact that Divya said that flourishing academically should not be at the expense of one's well-being. And although we know that some schools were doing some great work around mental health, before COVID, we also know that actually the provision was patchy. And what I hope is that the experience of COVID has actually made schools really focus, make wellbeing the absolute priority. So going forward now, my hope is that schools will really prioritise wellbeing and really, focus on that, because it will have sustained long-term impacts on children and young people's wellbeing and mental health. So actually schools will need to think about that going forward, I think. So I hope actually now this has given all schools the opportunity now to really put wellbeing right at the top of the agenda. Okay. Right, okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Anthea.
Hi, I'm Anthea Rose, and I work at Neolink Higher Education Research Institute, and I'm one of the co-conveners of the SIG group. And I'd like to introduce my colleague Kate Neal, who also works at the University of Lincoln with me on the Transitioning Students Effectively project funded by the OSF, with the subtitle of A Student-Led Approach to Mental Health Support for young people they're looking at young people from school and college into university. So it takes it up to the next stage from what Divya was talking about. And Kate's presentation today is called Adapting Transitional Mental Health Support in Higher Education During a Global Pandemic. I'm really looking forward to what Kate has to say.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction, Anthea. As Anthea mentioned, I'm a project manager based at the University of Lincoln, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit today about what we've done with our OFS funded project so far and how we've adapted to continue to meet our students' needs and keep the project on track with the impact of COVID-19. So in June 2019, we received £736,000 from the Office for Students to fund a student mental health project. This supports the transition of students as they move from school or college into higher education. We try and do this by increasing preparedness, managing student expectations, and also giving them awareness of the services that will be available on campus once they arrive at university. We have a core project team of 10, and half our team are based in the Student Wellbeing Service and half in the Digital and Student Life Service. And myself, I'm based with Anthea in the Lincoln Higher Education Research Institute. So I deal with evaluation, the data, and also the overall project management. The wellbeing team carry out outreach work in schools, and they go out and present to students usually from years 11 to years 13 in a variety of formats, from large assembly style presentations to more bespoke workshops. And the presentations centre around managing change, self-efficacy and self-management of emotions to help students as they go through these transitions into HE, or indeed if they don't go into HE, into the next stage of their life. We try and keep the presentations generic, so if students are not advancing to HE, it's still applicable to the next stage of their life. And to support this, our team in digital produce student-led content, so videos, blogs, vlogs, and our Fresh Take podcast, which is really successful now. That's had 5 episodes. Everything is co-created, and we're careful about timing. So we release our content at flashpoints throughout the academic year. So during exam time, for example, we might release content on stress. In September, October time, coming back after Christmas, we might release content on homesickness, as we know those are flashpoints for students and they'll need extra support at that time. Some of the other activities that are taking place, we've carried out an MBSP trial. Now, MBSP is mindfulness-based strengths practice. So it's, as it sounds, it's traditional mindfulness, but it also looks to work with people's strengths to help them develop. And one of our psychology professors recently completed a small-scale trial. The early data is really promising there, particularly in terms of increasing resilience for our students. We also have a digital part at Fika, and they have a smartphone app. And we work with them very closely to offer the content to our students. It's a little bit different to some of the traditional wellness apps in that it's rather like a physical fitness app. So there are emotional fitness workouts, there are courses students can do, there are tools for self-management, and we also have a range of ambassadors, some who are Olympic athletes and some who are professional rugby players. We're working with the Students' Union as well to embed wellbeing champions within their student union network. And we also hold the WOW Summer School, which stands for Wellbeing Orientation Welcome. And we have 80 students on campus usually. It's designed to orientate them into the typical kind of week at university. They stay in accommodation, they go to a sample lecture, they meet key staff, they take part in activities. And that's available to any student who might have declared either a disability or a mental health condition on their UCAS form. We invite them all to come along, and we try and accommodate as many of them as we can. The project is citywide, so our partners include Bishop Grosseteste University, Lincoln College, the NHS, Lincolnshire Police, Lincolnshire County Council and Lincoln Students' Union. And some of the most recent work we've done with our partners is we've started engaging some student creators at Bishop Grosseteste University, so to offer them the same opportunities as our students at Lincoln. We've produced some videos with Lincoln College, and we've also worked with NHS on a social prescribing app called Vitricare. So for that, we're producing content to put on tiles within the app to help students. So why are we doing this? Well, I'm sure we're all aware of some of the tragic headlines we see around student suicides and the fact that on average student suicide has increased by 79% over the last few years. However, most students aren't experiencing mental health crisis, and we are able to support them with a variety of low-level interventions, which is what we're trying to offer. And some of the key factors that might affect student wellbeing. Student expectations often do not match reality. So by the outreach team going out and increasing preparedness, we're trying to kind of get rid of that culture shock. So they know what to expect when they arrive on campus. We know early intervention is key. So all of our interventions are either pre-entry or at the point of entry, so students know where to access help immediately. We do know that psychological wellbeing of transitional students changes rapidly, often when they're faced with all the different pressures when they arrive on campus. They have to manage their finances, learn how to cook, learn how to do their laundry. Perhaps they're living with somebody that they don't necessarily get along with. So by making sure that we signpost them at an early stage, if they do experience a dip in well-being, we hope that they would know where to go. And with digital tools, we know they should be freely available and they should be student designed. So everything we do is co-created. Everything we do is available to the whole student population, because we know that digital tools should aim to reduce stigma and encourage self-efficacy. So by making the tools available to everyone, we're hoping to normalise the use of these kind of apps to self-manage wellbeing. It's also significant that medicalisation should be avoided. So everything we offer is preventative. Everything we offer is non-clinical. And indeed, our app looks like a physical fitness app. So of course, if we're aware that students do need clinical intervention, we will make sure that we signpost them to our own wellbeing services and onto the NHS if that's necessary. So a little bit more about why. So this chart from the available literature shows that the main challenges that 21st century students are facing. There are some academic concerns there, and whilst we can't deal with those, we will of course signpost students to appropriate academic help. But when we look at the non-academic concerns, many of them are based around practicalities, managing change and juggling new responsibilities. So by addressing this in our outreach work, we're hoping to tackle some of those issues. We see a huge increase in students arriving at wellbeing in the first few weeks because of all the pressures faced upon them. It creates a perfect storm when they're having to learn a new way to study and also a new way to live. So we do hope that we can reduce that culture shock. By aiming to demystify and prepare students, we hope that we can stop them getting to crisis point, and also that we signpost them early on, so if that crisis does happen, they're not afraid to get help. So what did COVID-19 do to our projects? Well, All of our outreach work and face-to-face support has ceased indefinitely, so we can't access our target audience. Film recording has to take place remotely, so there's challenges there around quality. We don't have access to the same equipment, we don't have access to the same editing software. Our student co-production also has to take place remotely. So we're concerned about how we continue to engage students when they've got so much on their plate right now, how we can continue to be a priority. When we thought of these key factors, we could have panicked. But instead, we decided one of the first steps was to understand exactly what our students' primary worries and concerns were at this time, and then we could think about how we could find ways to adapt the project to better support them. So for our interactive exercise now, I'd like everyone to think about the word cloud and submit maybe a word or a phrase. What were the concerns and worries of HE students in the early stages of remote study, social distancing and lockdown? So what was the typical HE student worried about at this stage? So someone's put getting their degree. So yes, academic concerns we know took centre stage. Students were worried about methods of assessment. Would remote assessment be fair? Progress, yes, would their progress be stalled? Perhaps some students might not have access to technology that makes them able to study offline. And completion as well, particularly for final year students. Library access is obviously, that's a big point as well. Students were worried about how they would access the library. I know fees being refunded were an issue, particularly around accommodation, and then we had a petition around not paying final semester accommodation fees. When we look a little bit more at the kind of mental health issues, people have mentioned loneliness and uncertainty, and we'll see as we go through this, there are things that we know were very significant. End of year celebrations, so that kind of rite of passage was possibly removed for some students, particularly final year students, not being able to say goodbye. So the feeling of the rug being pulled from underneath them all of a sudden must have been very significant to some students. And missing out on friends and lost university experience. There's some really good phrases there, and we'll possibly come back to that at a later date if we can, but I'm just going to move on to what we found were the main student concerns. So we gathered evidence from several areas. Our partner Safika carried out a small-scale study where they looked at existing transitional student concerns at the time. We gathered some anecdotal evidence from students, and we also had informed discussions with HE providers. And we found that the following factors were most worrying students. So they felt, I'm sure many of us did, a loss of control. What will happen next? There was intolerance to uncertainty, and a failure sometimes to understand that some questions simply can't be answered right now. There was a need to receive relevant information quickly, and this was often more quickly than the universities were able to make the information available to students. And because of that, some students channeled their energy into complaints. The other big concern was the loss of community through scaling back of societies, welcome events and transitional orientation activities. So for existing students, a lot of the societies, sports teams maybe that they take part in, are a big part of their self and their identity, and it's what defines them outside of their academic achievements. But also for transitional students, they were concerned that how would they make friends if things were done virtually? How would they meet up with people of like mind if societies were suspended? There were some other considerations that didn't necessarily come up in our data gathering, but there are things we'll need to think about as students come back onto campus. So bereavement, some students unfortunately will have lost family and friends. The effects of socialisation. So it may be difficult for some students to return to a busy environment when they've been relatively isolated at home. Worries about returning to campus, about the safety of campus. How will it be different? Will it look and feel different? Will it be safe for us? Concerns about leaving family behind. So perhaps students were caring for someone elderly or vulnerable. They were worried about how they might cope, or they might be worried that something might happen when they weren't there to help their families. And anxieties around socialising, new ways of studying and living with others. and getting used to being with other people again. So there has been some evidence from South China of increased rates of agoraphobia, social anxiety, and hypochondria after social isolation. And we have to consider that this may impact at least a small amount of our students. So what did we do? Well, we knew that the experience of our students were unprecedented, and we felt that all of our students needed additional support at this time, and that transition might now apply not just to first years, but all students readjusting to being back on campus. So we decided that we'd expand the project's definition of transition to encompass all returning students. We've done this with the blessing of the OFS, who are happy for us to make adaptations, so long as we still meet our original project objectives. Practically, what did we do? Well, our Fresher Take podcast moved quickly to remote recording, as we knew that was a really good route of support for our students. And we were able to release an episode on social isolation and remote study the first week of lockdown. We made our FEEC app available to all students. Previously, we'd been releasing it to controlled cohorts so that we could gather data to measure impact. But we now decided it was more important that all of our students receive the content. And we have found a way we can still track students by assigning codes to specific cohorts. There's new content we've been working on with FECA, which is focusing on bounce back, so bouncing back into university, bouncing back into life before COVID. As we were unable to do our outreach work, we produced digital resource packs for parents, teachers and students, which we sent out to schools for them to use. So transitional students are still getting key information at this time. Those are also distributed via Link Hire's online courses, Link Hire being part of the National NCOP, what's now the UniConnect partnership. So in doing that, we have also reached some schools that we weren't previously engaging, and it's very positive as we're going to enhance that work with Link Hire going forward. As I mentioned, there were challenges of filming remotely with concerns over quality, so we shifted our focus to animation and cartoons. We've recently developed some characters who will be in a series of animated shorts, which is something we probably wouldn't have done if COVID hadn't happened. Our WOW Summer School is going to be able to take place much later than planned in September, with reduced numbers at 42 because we're going to have to be able to social distance students. But we've also found a way to live stream the summer school. So in actual fact, we can offer that to any student that wants to be involved, and we'll actually reach a greater number of students as a result. And our Get Started week and our Fresh Start workshops, which concentrate on homework, we're also filming those with a digital team so that we can offer those virtually if social distancing means we can't offer those face-to-face. So what about the future of the project? Well, much is uncertain, depends on whether a second spike occurs or whether social distancing rules are tightened. So a lot we don't know. We do know that schools are keen for us to restart outreach work, and 7 schools say they'd like to see us back in September and October, but we are offering them a choice of either virtual or face-to-face presentations, whatever seems more comfortable to them. Our digital work is going to continue to evolve, so if we're going to do more animations and graphics, and as I said previously, that's probably the type of content we wouldn't have offered without the global pandemic. There are some big positives. The pandemic has helped us adapt our resources so that we can reach more young people more quickly. We have learned that we can be truly responsive to our target audience. And now we're confident that we can keep the project moving, no matter what happens in the world, in the next month, next 6 months, or the next year. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you found that helpful. I think we're probably going to go on to some questions now, if anyone's got any.
Thank you, Kate. Really interesting presentation there. There's a lot going on Twitter as well, if people are following. I think a big takeaway from your presentation there was that actually low-level intervention can be really effective. So thank you, and lots of synergy between the presentations we've had so far. Got one question here from Becky, which I think is a very specific question, but I'll see if you want to take this. To register a disability in higher education, there's typically a requirement for proof, so medical proof, which perpetuates the medical model of disability. How do we encourage the social model and allow testimonial justice for disabled students?
I must admit that's kind of way above what my understanding. One of my wellbeing team would be able to answer that, unfortunately. I do agree that medical definition is not necessarily helpful, and it doesn't capture the vast majority of our students, as we mentioned, that only require low-level non-clinical intervention. So I guess whilst there might be no easy answer in how we would register students, by us offering our interventions to all students and making them aware of it, hopefully we're kind of creating a little bit more of a level playing field there.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think it's also about separating impairment from disability as well. So, okay, so a person may have an impairment, a student may have an impairment, but actually that doesn't mean they need to be disabled. That doesn't mean they need to be denied access to services, goods and services such as education, if the university or the school or the college make the adaptations to cater for their needs. So if you separate disability from impairment, then the cause of disability then is rooted within society rather than within the individual. So I think that's a useful way of looking at it. Right then, colleagues, so I'm now going to introduce my colleague, Dr. Michelle Jamin, who will introduce our final speaker.
Hello, everyone. A really interesting conference so far, and I'm really delighted to warmly welcome our final speaker. That's Dr. Savita Meyer from UCL Institute of Education, and she will be sharing with us her research on youth mental health first aid in education settings, reappraising a complex evaluation approach given COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you very much, Savita.
Hello everyone, thank you Michelle. So I'm Savita Meyer, and I work as a lecturer and researcher at the UCL Institute of Education, and today I'm here to speak with you about our reappraisal really of the evaluation that we're conducting of youth mental health first aid within London settings. I'm trying to. Okay, here we go. So this is something now that we've all experienced. It's part of our shared history, albeit very short term. But certainly we've all been vigilant that just in a very short space of time, there's been such dramatic change in everybody's lives. So just as recently as March the 12th, when WHO declared the coronavirus disease outbreak caused by the coronavirus, that it was a pandemic, very quickly on from that, by April the 8th, schools were suspended nationwide in 188 countries, according to UNESCO. So what that meant was over 90% of enrolled learners, that accounts to 1.5 billion children and young people worldwide, were now out of education. So the adverse effects of school closure upon children and young people's lives began to be documented at that very time, including the potential to impact upon their mental health. So these adverse effects may be transient or they may be persistent. And so, just bear with me. And so in documenting the impact of school closure upon, due to COVID-19 upon children and young people's lives, adverse effects of school closure include, of course, the loss of education, harms to child welfare, particularly among the most vulnerable pupils. Nutritional problems, especially to children for whom free school meals are an important source of nutrition. Mental health problems, particularly for those with underlying mental illness and special educational needs, including ADHD and autism. But also what began to be documented, and partly also following on from research from previous epidemics and pandemics, that there are longer term mental health problems due to prolonged school closure and lockdown. Now, one of the considerations that had begun to be made was that education settings hold advantage for mental health provision. And this means that as educational settings are beginning to reopen, setting-based provision is increasingly being viewed to hold this advantage for mental health needs of children and young people within the communities they serve. So the mental health first aid programs continue to leverage education practitioners internationally in offering psychological first aid as and when needed, including within the moment in education settings. Research that's been conducted by Denise So research has been conducted by Denise in collaboration with National Health Service and also Public Health England. Okay, so sorry about that. I've had a little bit of a glitch in changing slides. A very recent review that was conducted by Denise in collaboration with the National Health Service and Public Health England proposed a framework based on their understandings from, well, ongoing understandings, not only from the current pandemic, but also from previous emergencies and disasters. And this framework proposes a coordinated national, local and local response across community. And that means parental, within home, schools, colleges, youth organisations, charities, as well as health services, such that this framework can enable this community to inform best practice in supporting children and young people. During and post COVID-19. There are potentially now here 5 levels of response that have been proposed. The first being psychological first aid, and this is administered within days or weeks by non-health professionals to ensure safeguarding, an assessment of needs, psychoeducation, which we may understand to be mental health literacy, providing information about the lived experience of reactions to stress and coping strategies to reduce this stress. But the framework also proposes a prevention of psychopathology, which is the adverse effects of stress, through group-focused intervention, again by non-health professionals, but now also bringing in specialist support from counsellors. And as the experience of the stress, of the emergency prevails, there begins to be a need for emphasising monitoring children and young people's mental health, in particular to be able to identify those who are presenting with psychiatric symptoms. And now this would be conducted by clinicians, and this is something that could become quite apparent and present itself within a month or a few months. So this sense of health professionals having the opportunity to refer these particular children and young people to clinicians, to health services, in other words, becomes a really important aspect of this framework in helping children and young people with their mental health. And of course, when we enter into the arena of medical support, what this means is children and young people have the opportunity for early treatment. And if there are ongoing issues in terms of their of the adverse effects that they have experienced, then there is the proposals for longer term treatments as well. Okay, so at UCL, we are evaluating youth mental health first aid programme in London education settings. So youth mental health first aid is an aspect of the government initiative for transforming children and young people's mental health provision, which was proposed in their green paper in 2017. And much of what I've just spoken about with respect to Dennis's evaluation does resonate, we feel, with what has been proposed for youth mental health first aid as a mental health provision within education settings. So we began in 2019 by evaluating the impact of youth mental health first aid upon education practitioners' practice in supporting children and young people's mental health before COVID-19 pandemic, and we continue to do this. However, due to setting closure, the impact of youth mental health first aid upon children and young people's mental health, their mental health literacy, their resilience and pro-social behaviour. So all of the information really that we were hoping to begin to glean in relation to children and young people needed to be paused. So this meant for us, and COVID-19 has meant for us, a need to just step back and to reappraise our evaluation approach so that we have time to consider what it is that we need to be mindful of when we are conducting our evaluation post-COVID-19, or at least when schools begin to reopen. So the key aspect of reappraisal was to conduct a scoping review of the emerging literature because there was so much of it. We focused on literature pertaining to the impact of crisis upon mental health. The reappraisal was to ensure that our approach to evaluating the impact of youth mental health first aid will continue to hold ecological validity, given the new norm within which youth mental health first aid will be implemented within when settings reopen. Today I will focus upon the reappraisal of our evaluation of youth mental health first aid upon children and young people, because this aspect of our evaluation was paused, so we have a chance to actually make any amendments that we need. And I will just refer to some of the key literature, and hopefully in doing that, I will give you an opportunity to gain some insights into some of the very recent understandings about the impact of COVID-19 upon children and young people's mental health, but also give you some insight into research that has been undertaken in prior years that is now very relevant within the context of COVID-19. So our evaluation approach itself aimed to understand mental health first aid in relation to what was already beginning to be understood from health education. But we aim to apply this to the education field. So health education is a field that emerged to support medical education. And so what we realized, and one of their focal points is the sense of developing literacies in medical intervention. And so what we began to consider was to apply this to the educational settings, and in particular to begin considering education interventions and how they would impact upon mental health literacy. But as I go forward, you'll realise that yes, there was much more that we also wanted to learn. The initial approach was further informed by the fact that we recognise that there are complex environmental influences, and our speakers, the speakers before me, have all really exemplified and illustrated the complexity of influences upon mental health and well-being. Now, these influences exist and occur across the lifespan. Now, specifically for children and young people's development in adverse communities served by education settings in London, this is what we are particularly focusing upon. But we've drawn insight from the Foresight Mental Health and Wellbeing Project, and I'm just going to show you really just a visual illustration of the complexity that exists. Now, the Foresight Project, Mental Capacity and Wellbeing Project, catalogued the influences upon children and young people's cognitive development. And part of that cognitive development relates to cognition, and what they began to recognize was that there are environmental influences vis-a-vis the family, vis-a-vis the education settings, the curricula that are being followed within education settings, but also individual differences with respect to children and young people. So, for example, their mental health and educational needs that they have and that are provisioned for. Of course, there is also a recognition that there are predisposed genetic influences as well. With respect to cognitive development, the project focused in to consider the effects of executive functions across the lifespan. And of course, our project is very much interested in the effects of executive functions or executive brain functions in children and young people, and the influences of the environment, as I've just discussed, upon that. So there's an impact or an influence of the environment upon brain function. That's something that we are using to inform and guide our evaluation. So just to give you a sense of appreciating this, this aspect of cognition, executive functions include core functions. So these would include working memory, flexibility, and inhibition control. But there are also higher order functions. And the higher order functions that we're interested in relate to emotion, cognitive, as well as action, i.e. decision making, regulation, as well as self-esteem and self-efficacy. Now, we also need to consider the information that has been gleaned from the Foresight Project in relation to the influence of COVID-19 pandemic as an academic factor. And in my previous slide, I talked about Viner's work and the adverse effects that had been catalogued by Viner and his colleagues in relation to school closure. And one of the aspects of considerations that they made was that there was a need to include the economic harms or the economic impact to working parents, to healthcare workers and other key workers being forced from work or forced to make decisions in relation to their work and to childcare. And this has the potential to influence children and young people's development. So what we are beginning to recognize or beginning to propose is that these environmental influences, and in particular now COVID-19, the influence of COVID-19 and school closure, could be mitigated by mental health provision in education settings, and certainly through curricula that are targeted for mental health and education needs. So in our evaluation, we are focusing upon conducting some case studies in a range of education settings in the hope of gaining more insights into this relationship between the environment and cognitive development. We're enlisting mainstream, SEN education settings, as well as PRUs and youth settings to enable us to do this. But we're also recognizing that youth mental health first aid, being a program that becomes embedded within school provision, has the potential to actually influence, have a positive influence upon children and young people's mental health and well-being. So the outcome of our reappraisal, the first outcome is that certainly we initially aimed to determine whether youth mental health first aid has an impact upon children and young people's mental health, their mental health literacy, their resilience, which is what I've just talked about in terms of the emotion, cognitive and action-related regulation, and how this influences self-help strategies as well as self-regulation, but also pro-social behaviour such as help-seeking and help-giving strategies, such as reaching out to others for support or to support others. So we propose the impact of youth mental health first aid would likely be associated with individual differences, such as whether or not there were requirements for special educational needs, alternative education provision, or social, emotional and mental health provision. We certainly believe that these are still ecologically valid and they're valid propositions. But given the fact that there is this complexity, and now we also would need to consider COVID-19 pandemic as part of this complexity, these environmental complexities, and the influence this would have upon children and young people. So we're recognizing that the lived experience of children and young people who have experienced education setting closures, that they are themselves, they would have experienced a transition at the point of the start of the lockdown, but now they're going to be experiencing another transition when they transition back into their education experiences. But this time this will be within their setting-based new norm. And this may have a potential to influence upon their mental health literacy, resilience, pro-social behaviour, those very things that we're interested in understanding. So the transition back into educational experiences will, we consider, be influenced by adaptive neurodevelopmental changes, i.e. developmental changes across time, which were acquired during the onset of the crisis, i.e. COVID-19 and setting closure, as well as further adaptive changes now when settings reopen. So we're considering these adaptive changes, and just to remind you, we're considering adaptive changes in relation to brain function, in relation to the executive functions that I spoke about, So we're understanding these adaptive changes are complex. And how is it that we could possibly begin to measure this complexity? So what we're considering is a proxy measure, potentially that would enable us to encompass the impact of the complexity. And this might well be delays in children and young people's educational attainment. So what this has meant for us is that we're having to really consider the evaluation measures that we propose when settings reopen. That is that we're having to consider and reconsider the primary versus the secondary versus the tertiary measures to manage any load upon participants involved. But also, we want to be able to ensure that our measures are also ecologically valid. So in this interactive activity, I'd like you to complete this poll. So in a sense, you get a chance to make your own decisions based upon your experience and insights during the COVID-19 pandemic. That what you will consider to be the most pressing impact of education setting closure upon children and young people that education practitioners must attend to when settings reopen. So I'll give you a few moments to begin thinking about your answer, and you can begin to respond by selecting one of these aspects of measures that you consider education practitioners must attend to when settings reopen. And we'll certainly come back and discuss the findings after my talk. I'll just give you a few moments to consider that. So just before I move on to the next slide, we will come back to this, but certainly we can see there is a sense that problems with mental health are coming across as being a primary measure. And certainly this is something that we have already recognised, that was in our original evaluation. Wonderful. And certainly the loss of emotion control, i.e. resilience, is something that we initially had. And so far, these delays in education attainment are certainly coming across as being potentially of a lesser significance at the start. And I think that's really what I'm understanding from the poll right now. So what they must, education practitioners, what they must attend to when settings reopen, problems with mental health, social interaction, loss of control, and then as time goes on, begin to consider delays in education attainment. Certainly that's what I'm gaining. Thank you very much, everyone, for your polls, but we can come back to this at the end if we want to discuss further. So I'm just going to finish in the last 5 minutes that I have in relation to how our approach to neuroadaptation in relation to mental health relates to mental health first aid. So given the COVID-19 pandemic and education setting closure, we recognise that there is the potential for youth mental health first aid training to be of value to education settings. Now, youth mental health first aid training includes raising education practitioners' awareness of the developing brain, the developing young brain, the social and emotional brain, the atypically developing brain, particularly in relation to ADHD and ASD. And there is a focus in providing information in relation to the effects of mental illness on brain function as well. So practitioners begin to gain insight into this. And so what this means is that parts, and what we're understanding from research, is that parts of the developing child and adolescent brain involved in emotional recognition and expression are fully online very early on, or even more active than when they become adults. So while parts involved in controlling emotions and impulsive responses are still reaching maturity. So this means that where a child or a young person begins to experience stress, they can certainly, they have the mental capacity to recognize that emotion and to express that emotion, but they don't have as much capacity to actually control those emotions or any impulsive behaviors that may ensue as a result of the stress. So changes in brain functions are influenced by predisposed genetic and environmental factors, as we've already understood from the Foresight Project. And this latter consideration, the environmental factors, include upbringing, culture, adversity, and crisis, which influence adaptive changes to brain functions. And just coming up to my last slide, I just want to emphasize this sense of understanding of adaptive changes, that they may be transient or persistent. So there is a need to be vigilant. I think this is just about my, this will become my penultimate slide, sorry. So these adaptive changes may be transient or persistent, and we consider these changes in relation to brain function, and these are dependent upon individual differences. So in the short duration of crisis, this may cause stress and anxiety. This is likely to be reversible. Prolonged duration of crisis may cause stress and anxiety, which may also lead to mental ill health due to loss of resilience. Our insights from Denise's work in relation to psychological first aid, such as youth mental health first aid, offered within days and months following an onset of crisis or transition, as we're discussing today, may attenuate the effects of stress and anxiety through development of mental health literacy, which may influence resilience and pro-social behaviour. So here what I'm alluding to is the sense of all the measures that I proposed within the poll. There could be an interaction or an interrelation between all of those particular functions that we could potentially measure. So coming up to my last slide, I just wanted to share with you, just as much as the environmental influence upon brain function is complex, the influence of stress upon brain function is also complex, and this exists across the lifespan. In this diagram, what McEwen's work is showing is the adaptive change in brain function with increasing amounts of stress and frequency, and he depicts this as an inverted U-shaped relationship, where we have acute or moderate stress, i.e. minutes, hours. The effects of that stress may actually enhance brain function and enable learning and self-preservation, i.e. resilience and emotional regulation. However, if acute stress is intense or traumatic, then there's a potential for suppression of function. As we move into an experience of more chronic stress, i.e. days to months and months to years, and some of you may be surprised by the very short timing here, the potential for adaptive change in brain functions leads to loss of resilience and potential more serious maladaptations in brain functions that may lead to long-term effects such as anxiety, depression, or trauma. So we're gaining insight into the potential of youth mental health first aid to be of value as a prevention, with support from non-mental health professionals potentially at the start through mental health literacy, in other words, informing children and young people about the experiences that they're having in relation to their mental health. But also we can recognise that youth mental health first aid can also be an intervention where non-mental health professionals vis-a-vis through their monitoring, because of the vantage that they hold within education settings, they're able to refer children and young people as quickly as possible to mental health professionals and mental health services and clinicians as necessary. So in conclusion then, overall, our reevaluation has meant that whilst before COVID-19 pandemic and education setting closure, we proposed to determine any association of youth mental health first aid upon children and young people's mental health, their mental health literacy, resilience and pro-social behaviour. And also whether any emerging inequalities were arising for the most vulnerable groups, such as those in special educational needs, alternative education provision, or social, emotional and mental health provision. We now have the opportunity to evaluate whether any delays in education attainment may be attenuated by youth mental health first aid through the development of mental health, resilience or pro-social behaviour. That is, we can determine whether the impact of youth mental health first aid upon children and young people's mental health, their mental health literacy, pro-social resilience and pro-social behaviour is actually mediated by the extent they transition back into their education experiences within the settings-based new norm. So just going back to the poll that I'd asked you all to complete, you can see now in terms of where we are with our evaluation, we find that we have the potential to make all of those 4 specific measures, but we may not necessarily gain the information at the first time point when schools are actually reopening, but across time we may get more insight into the influences upon those measures. So that means more time within settings. So I've included references if you'd like to learn more, and if you'd like to get involved, I've included here the link to the practitioner survey. If you'd like to undertake training programs, here is the email for youth mental health first aid, and if you'd like to speak with me in relation to our evaluation, then here is my contact details. And thank you very much everyone for listening and for completing my poll. And I will hand back to Michelle now.
Thank you, Savetta. I'm going to come in now with really interesting presentation, and we've got some questions. We are going to go slightly over time, and that's fine. And we just want to do these questions and then just open it up to wider questions then for the rest of the group. So Claire is asking, have you included exposure to domestic violence?
Yes, so this begins to come through in relation to the complexities that we're recognising in terms of the environmental influences, where there's a fine line that we are going to draw in relation to personal data. So this more personal level of data and information, we will only be able to glean through school data and through permission from not only school leaders, but also parents as well. So what that means is that we're held within the bounds of what people would like to share with us, and our conclusions will factor that in. But certainly we want to try and gain as much of a rich understanding of the actual lived experiences for children and young people during this lockdown.
Thank you.
Okay, and there's another question here from Alison. Thank you for that, Alison. Whether this new framework will be suitable to use within early years settings.
So that's a very interesting question. as I'd already alluded to, in relation to what we're understanding about child development, there are certain aspects of executive functions that are developed very early on. Certainly that sense of emotion recognition, as I said, and emotion expression is something that's expressed within the early years. There is beginning to be some very, very important literature and findings in relation to inhibitory control and flexibility in early years. But we're only just beginning to learn about the influence of emotion control, cognitive control, self-efficacy, because children at that age are so dependent. But what we are beginning to understand from an education intervention point of view, if we begin to emphasize mental health literacy, then we do find children from a very young age are able to almost recognize mental health issues, the positive mental health aspects for themselves. And as soon as that happens, then when there are any disturbances in that, and there are potential more negative feelings that are being experienced or that are being expressed, they would be much more articulate about that because of the mental health literacy that they've been privy to within their school setting.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, so Becky's asking, do you think that this pandemic may be considered to be an adverse childhood experience, and that there may be lifelong issues as well?
This is okay. So this is one of this was one of our main concerns, and this is why we kind of stepped back and we decided to conduct this reappraisal instead of just moving straight forward. What we are concerned about is that there are going to be a small group of people, children, young people, that are going to be experiencing adverse effects, and that there is going to be a knock-on effect in their transitioning, like I said, from the start of lockdown and now when they're actually transitioning back into school. And we need to be mindful, and we need to be vigilant, and we need to provide exposure vis-a-vis our evidence base in relation to these groups. The majority of our young children are resilient. They have very rich, positive experiences. And that means their resilience is very robust, and they will be able to maintain and hold themselves. But we are concerned about those children where these potential influences, these stressful influences, are going to impact upon their resilience. And if that's the case, then as quickly as possible, and certainly our literature review is kind of corroborating this, we need to intervene as quickly as possible. And hopefully, I mean, the real premise of youth mental health first aid that we're finding is that it endeavours to be a preventative type of intervention. So, you know, this notion of what Denise has now phrased as psychological first aid really resonated with us as a research team, where we recognise this is paramount. And we do know that schools are provisioning, educational settings are provisioning for this. So yeah.
Thank you, Savetta. Okay, so we're going to now try and answer some questions that we haven't had the chance to answer earlier. So Josie, this is a question for you. Did you see any difference between the participants' responses from different class and race? So did you look at social class and race and notice any differences?
Again, that's something that I think will follow in the more detailed analysis. There's definitely some kind of allusions in what people were saying to where they were living, the communities that their schools were based in, what their personal situation was in their own life. But yeah, that's too detailed really for us to answer now, I'm afraid.
And also, what what school leaders' roles were a priority during the pandemic?
I think that school leaders themselves, how they described their role, was really this thing of being a buffer to others in the school community. So being mindful of not burdening people with stress and anxiety, and actually attempting to soak up like a sponge the stress and anxiety that as much as they could to protect their staff, and also to reassure parents and reassure pupils that the school is safe as it's set up, and that they know that the plans that they've made will keep people safe. But what came through quite strongly was that perhaps leaders in some ways fell through the gaps in terms of support. So whilst they were attempting to support their staff, they didn't necessarily feel as though they had support from anywhere. So they were looking to broader networks, either at other schools, heads in other local schools, online communities and forums, to give them a chance to speak, and to supervision as well, as I said earlier. And I think for leaders, the other thing was feeling as though they could reassure people was one of the ways in which they actually felt they were coping. So separate to buffering the negative effects of COVID-19, there's also this sense of being able to reassure people, being able to preempt what's going to happen next and plan for it, so that you could reassure others. And leaders talked about almost like pockets of reassurance. So finding situations where they could say they were a couple of steps ahead a local school in terms of planning, they could share that plan, or they could have a conversation with someone about a time where they'd been through something very difficult, and that gave them a sense of being able to cope, because it was a familiar role in terms of being able to reassure others.
And you're in the hospital, so there's another question for you. So the latest DfE guidance on wellbeing recommends that schools design in staff wellbeing. Are there any best practice recommendations from the panel that schools should consider in doing this?
Well, I'm happy to start by just saying one thing, which is, as I finished the presentation, it's really about, in terms of staff wellbeing, but also what staff think about pupil wellbeing and the wellbeing of the school community. It is about a joined up conversation in which everybody is consulted, and not only consulted, but part of creating what the school policy is around wellbeing, so that it comes from the bottom up rather than the top down, and it is actually speaking to everybody's experiences and needs, which will all be different, and isn't something that's imposed on or artificially attached to the school purpose and values and aims overall. So it should really be the thread that runs through the whole school approach, and not an add-on, and that will result from all staff being part of that conversation, as well as other stakeholders like pupils, parents and the community. But I'm happy for others to chip in on that, since it was
I would. Thank you, Josie. I would just add to that. So yes, absolutely, it's got to be part of a whole school approach. Lots of schools are trying to reduce staff workload, so they're trying to reduce planning, marking, assessments, data management, etc., marking and feedback. But for me, it goes beyond that. So it's about trusting staff, it's about valuing staff, it's about creating a culture in which staff are absolutely valued and trusted and given autonomy and agency to do their roles. And I think that's key. I think, you know, if there's anything that we've learned from this, it's about the importance of staff wellbeing. And you know, I've heard some horror stories about schools continuing with lesson observations during the pandemic. So doing lesson observations virtually. So doing lesson observations of staff delivering online lessons. I mean, that's just crazy. It's just absolutely ridiculous. So this is about.
We've talked about this before in other BERA events from this SIG, but well-meaning things that seem to have a good purpose can have negative consequences for staff, which we won't know unless we have those conversations. So doing things like compulsory yoga on a Friday, or cakes in the staff room, or no work emails after a certain time, or lesson observations with a real focus to improve our practice, they can seem beneficial, but it's that consultation and conversation and collaboration that we need if we are actually going to find the correct ways of addressing how people feel going back into schools in September.
Yeah, we actually need to treat staff as adults and as professionals, don't we? And to me, that's the key.
And as human beings, Jonathan, if I can just come in there,
Please,
as
yeah.
human beings, because actually we're all struggling, and I would use that word, wouldn't I? But we are all struggling in our own way, whatever age we are, however much experience we have, whatever our role is, whether we've got a leadership position or whether we're a classroom teacher or a teaching assistant or whatever, a caretaker, for example, we're all struggling, and it's the humanity of that connection, I think, that we need to build on.
Thank you, Suzanne. So I think what the presentations have illustrated today is that there's some really rich research taking place into, looking at the impact of COVID-19 on children, young people and staff working within schools. And for me, the most exciting thing about doing research into mental health and well-being is the fact that it is multidisciplinary. So, we can take a psychological perspective, we can take an educational perspective, we can take a sociological perspective, we can take a philosophical perspective, we can look at arts and the creative, other subjects, etc., that really support mental health. So there is no magic bullet to solving the mental health crisis, if I can use that word. There's no magic bullet that will actually solve it. So we actually need a multidisciplinary approach because it's actually really complex. And it's only by actually having, teams of people coming from different disciplines working together, doing research, that will get closer towards addressing and solving the issue. So I think we need to continue the multidisciplinary approach, and I think it's an exciting time. But I think schools cannot just go forward and do more of the same. I think this is a real opportunity now for schools to reflect on what they do, and to think about how they might do things differently. But also the education system as well surely cannot just continue doing more of the same. So there's obviously implications for policy, for curriculum, for assessment, to actually think about developing a more an education system that actually really focuses on well-being and mental health. I think that's really key going forward. Okay, thank you, colleagues, for your time and commitment today. I hope you found the presentations interesting, and we look forward to releasing shortly more details of an event in the autumn where we will be looking more at the role of technology in mental health. So more details to follow. Okay, thank you.